preclinical. So you were working with Dr. Kennedy in Singapore on a mouse trial, I believe. Can you tell us about what the aim of that is and any update on it?
Yes, happy to. So the first trials were at the Buck in the C. elegans model, and we did about 18 months worth of work there. And then we did our first and second mouse studies at the Buck with Dr. Kennedy and as well as Dr. Gordon Lithau and several other people there at the Buck. And then Dr. Kennedy was recruited to the National University of Singapore. And so we then moved the mouse studies down there. And those later studies were all testing other compounds that are commonly believed to affect aging in a positive way. And so we tested everything that would come to mind, and then a half a dozen things that you probably wouldn't think of that other researchers have suggested may have an effect on aging. And in our hands, in the mouse model, none of them had any real meaningful effect on aging. And they did not, they were not additive in combination. And so they're not in the clinical product. Or the commercial product. And so those were the mouse studies that were done down there. And then, of course, we've moved into humans. And the trial that I'm talking about now, the retrospective trial that's using the TrueMe data, as I'd mentioned, hopefully that will be published shortly. So there are two other trials that are underway. We have what I would call a large, prospective, randomized, placebo-controlled trial going on at Indiana University, which is a 9-month study. And I think the last subject, volunteer, will have their follow-up within 2 weeks. And so it will take another 3 months or so before we have all that data collated. So somewhere around the end of the year, we'll sort of know what we have. The biggest problem, with the study really is that it was run through the pandemic. I think we had like 9 people enrolled, and then we had to shut the trial down for 2 months due to COVID before they were even willing to bring people back in. The trial was designed to treat healthy volunteers. The inclusion-exclusion criteria excluded you if you had cancer, if you had diabetes, if you had more than one chronic disease, age-related disease. And the real-world data has shown us that people who typically are older benefit more than people who are younger. People who are younger get a benefit, but the magnitude is larger. The percent may be similar, I don't know, but the magnitude is larger. And so the other assumption that you have when you design a major trial like this is that whatever is going on in people's lives, it doesn't really change from the time you start until the time you finish. So you're hoping that there's no change in diet, that there's no change in exercise, no weight gain, no weight loss, no stress. And of course, nothing could have been further from reality. People had family members who died, they lost jobs, they became very ill, they got vaccinated, they were taking fistfuls of vitamin D3, as everybody was, to try and improve their immune function. And the Buck paper, years ago showed that vitamin D3 does have a positive effect on lifespan and healthspan. And so we are seeing an effect in the Rejuvant group, but we're also seeing an effect in the control group. And so it'll be interesting to see how the data turns out. The trends are all positive. The race is on to see what's statistically significant at the end of 9 months. But I'm pretty confident there'll be some things that we'll get to talk about. If we redid the trial, we would do several things differently. And we may decide to do that in order to be able to gather more data. But there are things that are different about blood work. And we're trying to use several different clocks, the Levine clock, for example, to sort of further validate that you can pick up a signal And, it's going to be very interesting, A, because it was run through a, pandemic, which probably be the first and only trial to do that. And, B, we were using something that we have shown in earlier studies, actually has an effect on biologic age. And so I'm anxious to see what we've got, at the end of that trial. So, look for that. I don't know how long that'll take to get published. That's the other issue that's kind of always annoying from an entrepreneur's perspective, because we tend to have a different sense of urgency. And then we've also started another trial that's going on in Detroit at a manufacturing facility. And this is a 2-year trial. We have about 130 volunteers that are about to enroll. And basically, they're taking Rejuvant, and then we are measuring various biologic markers, physiologic markers, taking blood work, doing blood pressure, that sort of thing, every 6 months. And the objective of the study is to see whether or not taking Rejuvant actually reduces total healthcare costs, because this is a self-insured manufacturing company. And so they have on-site healthcare with a wellness provider that does this. And the provider is very excited about doing this study. So, we believe there is a good chance that if we're able to do what we did in the mouse model, which was to postpone the onset of age-related diseases, this is especially interesting to a self-insured company, because once a worker turns 65, of course, they typically go on Medicare, and they're off the balance sheet from a risk point of view. And so if you're self-insured, you would like that all of your workers didn't get sick until they were after 65. And so we sort of saw that in the mouse model. And so the experiment is to see whether or not we might see that in humans. And that gets back to the compression of morbidity, which we saw in the mouse model of over 50%, where you increase the period of disease-free living for the mice. And, if that translates into the human model, then potentially people could live healthier lives without getting sick. And those who are self-insuring would benefit from that. And so that's what that trial is about. And then there's another trial that actually Brian Kennedy is doing in Singapore, and they'll be testing Life AKG, in other words, the timed release calcium alpha-ketoglutarate that we make, which is the key ingredient in Rejuvant, but they don't want to use Rejuvant because they don't want to bother with a sex-specific product. They want something that they can give, and they're going to give it to older people who are closer to being taken care of by the government, and the government would like to understand how expensive that's going to be, and if this is able to reduce costs by keeping people productive for a longer period of time and out of the hospital. So similar a little bit to the study in Detroit, but also a little bit different as well.
Has the one with Dr. Kennedy, has that started?
No, it has not started yet.
It's not started yet. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, securing the funding is the key thing, right, in academia. And so they have somebody they believe will provide the funding that they need, and they're getting close. So I haven't yet provided them with the product, so I know that they haven't started yet.
Okay. So I actually wanted to go back. There was a couple of questions for those trials. So for the first trial, the primary outcome is CRP. It's like is the measure of inflammation, CRP. So why was that picked as the primary outcome?
Well, in a small number of people, Dr. Kennedy was able to determine in culture and in tissue that calcium alpha-ketoglutarate was able to inhibit cytokine signaling in senescent cells, which then greatly reduces inflammation. And so in early anecdotal human data, we were showing that people who had CRPs tested prior to taking the product were able to show a reduction in CRP over time. It was a poor choice for a variety of reasons. One, we sort of assumed that the sponsor, our partner at Indiana University, would take fasting CRP, and they did not. And we didn't specify it in the trial, so it's not really their fault. We made an assumption, which was a poor assumption. And so only about 2/3 of the way through the trial did we realize it should have been the high specificity CRP. And so we didn't have enough specificity in the early data to show a difference. And so that was a trial design flaw. Furthermore, there are so many things that could influence CRP, especially in a pandemic, for example. And that data is bouncing all over everywhere. And so I have no idea what we will see at the end. Glyc-A is probably a better thing to measure for inflammation. It's much more stable. But at the time we designed the trial, we had to have something as the key endpoint. And, that has turned out to be a poor choice. But fortunately, we're measuring everything under the sun. We're using a group out of Finland called Nightingale, which measures 200 different biomarkers in the blood samples. And so we have a ton of data that we will analyze and take a look at, what was different between test and control. But the pandemic is hugely problematic from a trial design perspective.
Right. Yes, got it. So in the Detroit 2-year experiment that they're doing, are they doing that kind of at the level where they'll be able to produce a paper at the end? I mean, and is their endpoint like the reduction in cost?
That is a key consideration. The issue really is, could you see a reduction in 2 years? I have no idea. But from a practical point of view, it's very difficult to run a trial even 2 years in length. And so again, we're using Nightingale, so we're doing standard blood draws as well. So we're going to have DNA methylation testing, the standard blood draw, and then the Nightingale draw. And so again, we're going to have a lot of data. They'll be taking blood pressure, a variety of other things. And so if, for example, we saw a reduction, and this is not meant to say that you would see this reduction. I'm not saying that the product can have an effect on this biomarker, but pick a biomarker like triglycerides, for example. So if you showed a reduction in triglycerides, well, I'm not saying that the product does that, but if you showed a reduction in triglycerides, then a cardiologist might say, eventually, that probably will save cost, right? Or if there was a weight reduction, for example, you could say that eventually that probably would reduce costs. And so the wellness company that's providing this service and running this for us, and they've actually volunteered to do this without charging us because they're terribly interested in seeing whether or not this actually works. If you saw a reduction in a couple of biomarkers that are classically oriented with cost as time goes on, they would probably conclude that this is beneficial, even if within 2 years they didn't see a reduction in cost. And so they're intrigued, even though the trial may not be long enough to see that, but we might begin to it. And there were no restrictions. We have people who have cancer, who have diabetes, who have heart disease, who have high blood pressure. And so it's just a cross section of their employees that were willing to volunteer. And we didn't, exclude anybody. It's kind of an all-comers trial. And so, I think it'll be very interesting.
Is the plan to kind of make the anonymized data available?
Well, I would like to see it become available. It's not actually our data, right? It's their employees.
Yeah.
And so that's a subject that will come up at a later point in time.
Right.
And if everybody is blinded, which of course they are, we have no idea who these people are or what their backgrounds are. They're just telling us that we have a very diverse group of people that have volunteered. Then I would love to see it. I will know what the data is, and it will benefit the company and the claims that we may try and make or not make. Then, but I don't know whether or not it would be available to the public because it's not entirely my decision. I would like to think that it would be, yes.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. And I fully understand that. I mean, it's much harder in that circumstance.